The grand ballroom of the SS Oceana glittered like a jewel, chandeliers spilling golden light across polished floors. Elegantly dressed passengers swirled to the sound of a live band, the music a rich backdrop to their laughter and champagne toasts. Outside, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, dark and unknowable, cradling the ship in its vast and silent arms. At the center of it all, Edward "Eddie" Price sat hunched over his violin, his bow gliding across the strings with mechanical precision. To the untrained ear, the music was flawless. To Eddie, it was hollow. Once hailed as one of the greatest violinists of his generation, Eddie now played for audiences who couldn't care less about artistry, only ambiance. As the band transitioned into a lively waltz, Eddie's mind drifted. He wasn't here. He was in a small concert hall years ago, playing alongside his wife, Rose. Her laughter, her energy, her passion, they were the reason his music had come alive. But Rose was gone now, taken by an illness that arrived as swiftly as a storm. Without her, the music had become a shell, just like him. Between sets, Eddie retreated to a corner of the ballroom, ignoring the compliments from the passengers. His usual ritual: 1 whiskey, 2 cigarettes, and solitude. "Excuse me, Mr. Price?" a nervous voice interrupted. Eddie looked up to see Lila, a girl barely out of her teens, clutching a battered violin case. Her dress was simple, her face alight with youthful enthusiasm. "I just wanted to say, it's an honor to meet you," she said, her words tumbling out. "Your music, it's why I started playing. I listen to your recordings every day." Eddie sighed. He could see where this was going. "Thanks," he said curtly, looking back at his drink. Lila hesitated, then pressed on. I was wondering if you might have a moment. Just a tip or two, anything would mean the world." Eddie studied her for a long moment. She was so eager, so full of hope. It reminded him of himself at her age, back when he still believed in the power of music to change lives. "Practice scales," he said flatly, "and don't expect anything from it." The light in Lila's eyes dimmed. She nodded quickly, muttering, "Of course. Thank you for your time," and hurried away. Eddie leaned back in his chair, guilt swirling in his chest, but he didn't chase after her. What was the point? Inspiration wouldn't pay the bills or heal the wounds life carved into you. That night, Eddie found himself alone on the observation deck. The cold wind tugged at his coat as he stared at the dark sea. The waves moved in silent, rhythmic patterns, a stark contrast to the chaos that churned within him. The captain's voice broke the stillness over the intercom. "Good evening, passengers. We've made a minor course adjustment due to reports of ice in the area. There's no cause for concern. Please enjoy the rest of your evening." Eddie barely registered the announcement. He stayed on the deck for a long time, letting the cold seep into his bones. The faint strains of the band playing their final set floated through the night air. Life on the Oceana continued as always, unaware that the ship's fate was quietly shifting beneath their feet. The next morning, Eddie returned to the ballroom to collect his violin. A strange tension hung in the air. Crew members moved briskly, whispering to each other. A woman hurried past with her child in tow, the fear in her eyes unmistakable. Eddie frowned. He stepped outside and was immediately met with the sharp metallic groan of the ship's hull. The sound was wrong. Deeply wrong. Before he could process it, an announcement echoed through the halls. "Attention passengers, please proceed to the lifeboat stations in an orderly fashion. There is no need to panic." But panic had already started to spread. Eddie's instincts kicked in. He moved quickly through the corridors, dodging passengers as they gathered life jackets and clutched at their families. His thoughts turned to his violin, his only connection to Rose. He had to get it before he did anything else. As he reached the deck, Eddie spotted Lila. She stood near the railing, her violin case clutched tightly to her chest. Her wide eyes darted around, mirroring the growing fear of those around her. "What's happening?" she asked as Eddie approached. Eddie didn't answer. The deep groan of the ship echoed again, louder this time. The SS Oceana was sinking, and neither of them knew if they'd survive the night. Chaos erupted on the decks of the SS Oceana. The once elegant ship was now a theater of panic. Families clung to one another, crew members shouted directions over the din, and lifeboats were being hastily lowered into the icy Atlantic. The frigid wind whipped through the air, cutting through clothes and numbing fingers. Eddie and Lila stood at the railing, both clutching their violins like lifelines. The ship groaned beneath them, a haunting metallic sound that underscored the urgency of their situation. "Get to a lifeboat!" Eddie shouted over the noise. Lila shook her head. "There's no room. They're saying women and children first." "Exactly! Go!" Eddie barked. But Lila didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the crowd surging toward the remaining lifeboats, the raw desperation etched on every face. "What about you?" she asked. "I'll figure it out," Eddie said, though the truth was he hadn't planned that far ahead. All he could think about was Rose's violin. He wasn't leaving it behind, not in this life or the next. As they moved through the corridors, Eddie's sharp instincts kicked in. He scanned every shadow, every creaking corner, calculating the fastest route to his cabin. Around them, the ship tilted slightly, making movement harder with every passing second. The icy water was encroaching, filling the lower levels of the ship with a chilling inevitability. They reached Eddie's cabin. His hands were trembling, not with fear, but with urgency, as he unlocked the door. Inside, the violin case rested on the bed, untouched. Eddie grabbed it, clutching it like a lifeline. "That's it?" Lila asked breathlessly. "You risked everything for that?" "It's not just a violin," Eddie snapped. He stopped himself. There wasn't time to explain. "Let's move." As they made their way back toward the deck, a new sound stopped them in their tracks. Shouting. Harsh voices, aggressive and commanding. Eddie motioned for Lila to stay back and crept forward, peeking around a corner. A group of men, passengers and crew alike, had formed a barricade at one of the lifeboat stations. They were hoarding supplies, jackets, life vests, even oars, and denying access to anyone who didn't meet their approval. At the center of the chaos stood a man with a commanding presence, Mick "Iron Hand" Sullivan, a notorious gang leader Eddie recognized from the tabloids. Mick's sharp eyes and gravelly voice cut through the noise. "Back off!" he barked at a desperate father, trying to get his wife and child onto the lifeboat. Mick's men shoved the man away without mercy. "This boat's full. Find another?" Eddie clenched his jaw. "Of course it's him," he muttered. Lila frowned. "You know him?" "Only by reputation. He's not the kind of guy you argue with." "We have to do something," Lila whispered, her eyes darting to the terrified family. "Do what? Play him a song?" Eddie said bitterly. But Lila wasn't joking. She took a step forward before Eddie could stop her, her violin case clutched tightly in her hands. "Wait!" she shouted. Mick turned, his piercing gaze locking onto Lila. "What do you want, kid?" "Let them on the boat," she said, her voice trembling but determined. Mick laughed, a low, cruel sound. "And why would I do that?" Lila swallowed hard, then opened her violin case. She lifted the instrument and raised her bow. "Because I'll play for you." The crowd fell silent, confused and stunned by her audacity. Even Mick looked taken aback. "Play? You think music's gonna fix this?" "No," Lila said, "but it'll remind you of who you are." The ship tilted further as Lila began to play, the notes trembling at first but growing stronger. Her bow danced across the strings, the melody rising like a fragile hope amidst the chaos. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. The music cut through the panic, wrapping itself around everyone who heard it. Eddie watched, awestruck. It was the kind of playing he hadn't seen in years. Raw, emotional, fearless. Mick's hard expression faltered. He stared at Lila, the melody pulling something from deep within him. Memories, perhaps. Regrets. The moment was shattered by a sudden jolt. The ship groaned violently, throwing passengers to the ground. Water surged onto the deck, icy and unforgiving. The SS Oceana was rapidly losing its battle with the Atlantic. Mick barked orders to his men. "Get them on the boat! Everyone now!" Lila's gamble had worked, partially. Mick's humanity had been stirred, but the ship wasn't giving them time to celebrate. Eddie grabbed Lila's arm. "We've got to move!" As the lifeboat was lowered, Eddie and Lila stayed behind, watching as others were safely evacuated. There wasn't room for them, not yet. Mick turned to them. "You two, come with me. There's another way out." "You expect us to trust you?" Eddie asked, his voice sharp. "You don't have a choice," Mick shot back. "This ship's going down, and I know where the cargo lifts are. They'll get us closer to the waterline." Eddie hesitated, but Lila pulled him forward. "We have to try." The three of them navigated the sinking ship together, moving through tilting hallways and ankle-deep water. Mick's knowledge of the layout was uncanny, and despite his gruff demeanor, he made sure they stayed together. They reached the cargo hold, but the situation was worse than they'd feared. The water was rising fast, and the lifeboat Mick had hoped to use was tangled in debris. "We're out of time," Eddie said, his voice grim. Mick looked at them, a rare vulnerability flashing across his face. "You two go. I'll figure something out." "Like hell," Lila said. "We're not leaving anyone behind." Eddie stared at her, astonished by her courage. Then he nodded. "All right, we figure this out together." The three unlikely allies braced themselves against the rising water, their survival now tied to each other inextricably. The SS Oceana groaned one final time, warning them that their time was running out. The cargo hold of the SS Oceana was a battlefield of desperation. Water surged with merciless speed, swallowing crates and steel beams alike. The ship's groaning echoed through the chamber like a monster's final breath. Eddie, Lila, and Mick stood on the edge of a rising tide, each breath a gamble in the freezing air. "There's no time!" Eddie shouted, his voice barely cutting through the chaos. He clutched Rose's violin case, the symbol of a promise he refused to break. Mick's sharp eyes scanned the hold. "We need to cut that debris loose," he barked, pointing to the twisted steel trapping the lifeboat. Eddie hesitated. "And then what? It's flooded." "It's our only shot," Mick growled, "unless you got wings stashed in that case of yours." The words stung, but Eddie nodded. The three of them moved into action, pulling at the tangled steel with everything they had. Each second felt like an eternity, the water rising past their knees, then their waists. Lila's hands trembled as she tried to unfasten a stubborn rope. She slipped, her legs plunging into the icy water. Eddie was by her side in an instant, pulling her up. "I'm fine," she said, her teeth chattering. "No, you're not," Eddie snapped, forcing her to meet his eyes. "But you're going to be..." Across the hold, Mick used a crowbar to wrench loose a chunk of debris. His movements were frantic but precise, like a man fighting for more than just his life. "Got it!" Mick shouted as the lifeboat broke free. It bobbed awkwardly in the rising water, a fragile salvation. They clambered into the boat, water lapping at its edges. Mick grabbed the oars, his muscles straining as he maneuvered them toward an emergency hatch. "This'll lead to the open sea," he said. "If we're lucky." "Big if," Eddie muttered, but he didn't argue. He was too focused on keeping Rose's violin above the waterline. The hatch was jammed, Mick cursed, slamming his shoulder into it repeatedly. The seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last. The ship tilted sharply, sending crates crashing into the water. "We're out of time!" Lila screamed. Eddie locked eyes with Mick. We worked together, on three. The two men pushed with everything they had. With a deafening groan, the hatch gave way, spilling moonlight into the hold. The freezing air bit at their faces. But it was a lifeline. As they paddled into the open sea, the reality of their situation hit them. They were three specks in an endless expanse of water. Behind them, the SS Oceana was sinking, its once proud silhouette breaking apart and vanishing beneath the waves. Eddie turned to Lila, her face pale and streaked with seawater. "You okay?" She nodded weakly, clutching her violin. "Still here." Mick, his hands blistered from the oars, gave a bitter laugh. "Never thought I'd be grateful to a violinist?" For a moment, there was only the sound of their labored breathing and the creak of the lifeboat. But then a new sound broke the silence, a low, ominous rumble. Eddie's heart sank as he turned to see a massive wave, the ship's death throes sending a final shockwave through the water. "Brace yourselves!" Mick shouted. The wave hit them like a sledgehammer. The lifeboat flipped, tossing all three into the icy abyss. Eddie's lungs burned as he fought to the surface, his eyes darting frantically. He spotted Lila struggling against the current. "Lila!" he screamed, swimming toward her. His limbs felt like lead, but he refused to let go. He reached her just as her head dipped beneath the surface, pulling her up with all his strength. They clung to the overturned boat, shivering uncontrollably. "Where's Mick?" Lila gasped. Eddie scanned the water, his heart pounding. A figure emerged, coughing and sputtering. Mick dragged himself onto the boat's edge, his face pale but determined. "Still alive," Mick muttered, collapsing beside them. "Not bad for a thug, huh?" Eddie managed a weak smile. "You did good." Mick's laugh turned into a cough. "Don't get used to it." The hours that followed were a blur of cold and exhaustion. The horizon offered no solace, just an endless stretch of water. Lila's teeth chattered violently, her violin still clutched in her arms. Eddie placed his coat around her shoulders, his own body trembling with cold. "Why?" she asked through chattering teeth. "Why did you save the violin?" Eddie hesitated. "It's not just a violin. It was my wife's. She believed music could save lives." Lila's eyes glistened with understanding. She hugged the violin tighter, as if it carried Rose's spirit. Dawn broke, painting the water in shades of gold. A faint hum reached their ears. At first, Eddie thought he was imagining it, but the sound grew louder. "Is that—" Lila's voice was barely a whisper. A rescue ship appeared on the horizon, its lights cutting through the morning haze. Relief washed over them like a wave, heavier than the ocean. "We made it," Mick muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. As they were pulled aboard, Eddie felt the weight of the violin in his hands. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a symbol of everything they had endured. He looked at Lila, then at Mick, two strangers who had become his allies, his friends. "We didn't just survive," Eddie said softly. "We lived." Lila nodded, her fingers brushing the strings of her violin. "And we'll keep living." Mick smirked, his usual bravado tinged with sincerity. "Guess I owe you two more than I thought." Eddie smiled. "You can pay us back with a song." The three of them laughed, their voices rising above the waves. In that moment, they weren't just survivors, they were a symphony. The rescue ship carried Eddie, Lila, and Mick to safety, but their ordeal didn't end at the shoreline. Reporters swarmed them, eager to capture the story of a gang leader, a grieving violinist, and a war-hardened veteran who had escaped a sinking ship together. The questions came fast and loud, but the three exchanged silent looks. They weren't ready to share everything. Not yet. A week later, they reunited in a quiet, dimly lit cafe by the harbor. The smell of salt lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of coffee. Lila placed her violin case on the table, her fingers brushing it as though she still couldn't believe it had survived. "I have a performance next week," she said softly. "First since everything. I want you both to come." Eddie nodded. "I wouldn't miss it." Mick shifted uncomfortably but grunted his agreement. "You got guts, kid. I'll be there." The night of the performance came quickly. The concert hall was packed, the audience buzzing with anticipation. Lila walked on stage, her eyes scanning the crowd, until she spotted Eddie and Mick in the front row. She gave them a small, grateful smile. As the first notes filled the air, the room fell silent. Lila's music was haunting and raw, a melody that seemed to carry the weight of the ocean, the terror of the sinking ship, and the fragile beauty of survival. Eddie felt his chest tighten, Rose's memory alive in every note. Mick, uncharacteristically quiet, leaned forward in his seat. The music stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in years. Redemption, perhaps. Or maybe just hope. When the final note rang out, the audience erupted into applause. Lila stood, her hands trembling, her eyes glistening. Eddie and Mick rose to their feet, clapping louder than anyone else. Backstage, they gathered around her. Mick, in a rare moment of vulnerability, pulled her into a one-armed hug. "You killed it, kid." Eddie handed her a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was a polished brass plaque engraved with the words, "For those who find light in the darkest seas." Lila looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you?" "No," Eddie said, his voice steady. "Thank you for reminding us what living means.